what happened once at a wedding reception, where this guy had to give the speech, the best man, and he got up in his toilet roll. He said, look, it was a very long speech, so I had to put on the toilet roll. So he started to unwind it and said, in conclusion, oh, I'm sorry, I've got the wrong end. We're going to be looking at two topics today. The first one is the existence of God, and the second one is about Christianity being a blessing or a curse. I've been asked to speak on these two topics, and in a way it's quite difficult because the first one is quite a big one. So what I've tried to do, I'm not going to use overheads, but instead I'll use notes, and what I've done is I've given you a one-page summary of a 42-page chapter in my talk. So you can realise the problems that I've had. That's why I thought the toilet roll, well, you chuck it away and we just have something short. So today I'm really going to concentrate just on an overlook at things, and we want to spend some time on having discussion. And the other thing too is that you hopefully will all have got a sheet eventually which is talking about setting up a Christian apologetics group so that we can do this regularly, perhaps once a month. And there are all sorts of questions, and we're just looking at two of them today, and I'm sure you all have other questions. At question time we'll try and focus on the topic. It's so easy to take off somewhere else and eventually move right away from the two topics. So we'll try and keep focused. What I'm going to do is the first part I'll give a talk for about, it's getting shorter as the time goes on, we'll watch it over there now. And then we'll have, say, about 20 minutes, and we have to cut down 20 minutes, and then we'll have some time for discussion, and then we'll have the second talk, and then time for discussion. So that way we'll break it up. I'll give you a chance maybe to have a drink in between, or walk out if you had enough. I'm glad you're all here. I'd like to welcome you all, which I should have done at the beginning. I hope you all got some opposition. I hope you're all warming up, because I'm still a bit shivery. So it's good to see you all. One of my problems is that I don't need glasses to read, which is very annoying. So I have to take them on and off. So anyway, as I said, it's a big subject, and I'm just going to give a brief summary. The question, is there a God, is actually a philosophical one. It's not a scientific one, though some people think otherwise. Because we can't put God under a microscope and say, here's a bit of God. And the other problem is we can't actually argue with God in a sentence, because God in a sense is undefinable. So we do have problems from a scientific point of view and from a logical point of view. This doesn't mean we can't use logical arguments. What is interesting, it's been estimated by an atheist that about 25 to 30% of philosophers are Christians. And I think one of the reasons for this is that there are very powerful traditional arguments going back to Aquinas and Augustine, or arguments for the existence of God. And it's these that have convinced people, not just faith, but the logic of these arguments that have led to philosophers becoming Christians. So although logic is important, I think for me my approach is more evidence-based approach, which is what a lawyer would do. In the end everyone has to accept certain assumptions. We all have them, and we accept them by faith. And often when you're talking to people, they'll have a go at yours, but they won't think of examining their own assumptions. And so I find if you do get into an argument or a disagreement or a friendly chat with somebody and you disagree with them, if you can sometimes focus on, well, what are your assumptions? What do you believe? And you can have a go at theirs. And you'll find they haven't really thought about their assumptions. So there are a lot of things that people hold by faith. And recently there have been 4 atheists, Harris, Dennett, Dawkins and Hitchens, some people call them the 4 horsemen. They've received a lot of publicity and each written a book on atheism, but they've been well and truly answered, and people don't know about it. They think that Dawkins and co, are better than sliced bread, but the real issue is that there are good, solid answers, and some of the answers are on the book list. There are a couple of books there which I think, which 3 of us have compiled. I hope you've all got a book list. There'll be some available if you haven't. But they've answered those questions extremely well, philosophically and all other ways. Now, since part of the evidence for the existence of God is scientific, it is appropriate to at least look at the nature of science, what it can prove and can't prove. And science depends on a number of unsupported beliefs, which I've written out there on the page. The universe is an ordered and rational place, so that doing science makes sense. Why should it? The underlying laws of nature governing the universe are mathematical, and in a sense, simple. Simple in the way they look, but not simple in their understanding. And the question is, why is this so? The laws of nature are stable over time, and are the same through the part of the universe that we can observe. So why isn't there chaos? Why is there stability? Our minds are rational, at least some of us, and we are capable of uncovering the laws of nature. We seem to be designed to do science. Why is that? The reason from a biblical point of view is that we are made in the image of God, and therefore in some small way we have the power to reason and to comprehend the universe and to, as it were, think God's thoughts after him. We have the ability to understand. Now, those that say that science is a source of all truth, that's self-defeating because you can't use science to prove that statement. Well, I'll say that again. Science is a source of all truth. That statement cannot be tested by the scientific method. Another problem is the danger of extrapolating one branch of science into another. We've seen this in evolution, where people have taken a biological theory and they've planted in religion, philosophy, and so on and so on and so on. And they're not justified in doing that. I mentioned that mathematics is involved here. One of the things about mathematics is it's not about the real world. You see, I can talk about a straight line. If I gave you a straight line, would you know it's a straight line? Get out your ruler. Is your ruler straight? In fact, you don't know what a straight line is. We can't. All we can do is we can measure things as accurately as we can, but we don't know it's a straight line. A straight line is an abstract object. I mean, that's a straight line. The side of the door is a straight line. We have a family of straight lines. How do we define a straight line? We define it mathematically. So if you look on your sheet, you'll see y equals ax plus b. That's the equation of a straight line. So that if you have a graph, and along here you put a value of x, put in a value of y, and you plot them, you get a straight line. That's a perfect straight line because it's defined mathematically. So mathematics is not about the real world, it's about an abstract world. Now, why does it work? Why can we use mathematics? It's because we can do things pretty accurately and pretty carefully so that we approximate to the ideal situation and we get answers which are very close to the right answers. And so, for example, you take a circle. A perfect circle is a perfect circle, but we can't do a perfect circle, or even if you had one, you wouldn't know it's perfect. But if we have a perfect circle in our minds, then applied mathematics, we can find the area. It's pi r squared. And therefore we can use that concept to do circular things and get them pretty well right. So mathematics is about abstract things. We can go on to triangles. If we know a triangle has perfectly straight sides, and therefore if we can define a perfect triangle, we can work out mathematically its area, and so on. That's another mathematics. So what we see then is mathematics can give us a good approximation to reality. Mathematics is based on assumptions, so if you do want to use mathematics, you've got to check that the assumptions are sort of satisfied accurately enough so you can do it. I want to say a bit more about the scientific method. How does science work? Well, what we do is that we measure things and we come up with some sort of theory to explain the pattern. And then we do other experiments to see if the experiments fit the pattern. If they do, we say, well, the theory's okay so far, let's try another measurement. And so we go on taking measurements, and so the scientific law is on probation. It's on probation. It's only accepted for the time being. And the idea is that the only way you can say that science develops is that it's okay for the time being. There's no such thing as a scientific law being true. All you can do is prove the scientific law is false. It's accepted for the time being. Some laws can be derived mathematically, as we saw above. They depend on assumptions which need to be varied experimentally. It's like Boyle's law, which says pressure times the volume equals a constant under constant temperature. that you can verify chemically by doing different volumes and different pressures and show that the law works. But that law is derived mathematically. A good example of scientific process is about Newton's law. Now Newton, he developed the laws of mechanics, and he had an inverse square law about gravitation. And there were some irregularities observed on the planet Uranus. And Newton's theory not only explained the irregularities, but able to indicate where it was. So Newton's theory worked really well with respect to observations. However, they found another strange observation with regard to Mercury's orbit. They tried to use Newton's laws, wouldn't work. So what happened was in 1915, Einstein developed his theory of relativity. And by applying that theory, they were able to account for the discrepancies they saw in Mercury. It was called the perihelion precession of Mercury. So Newton's laws are surprisingly accurate, but they weren't enough. They didn't allow for very, very special situations. So a scientific law is only on good behaviour. The thing about scientific law is it must be able to be falsified. If you can't dream up an experiment, which if you carry out can show the law is wrong, then it's not a scientific theory. And a lot of theories that people have, they put up and say this is a scientific theory. It's not. Because if it's not falsifiable, then it's not a true scientific theory. All right, let's get on to the arguments about the existence of God. How are we going for time? We're sort of roaring along here. The first argument for the existence of God is the argument for abstract objects. I've already talked about the fact that there are abstract objects. For example, I can talk about 5 apples, 5 pears. What about number 5? Number 5 is an abstract object. It represents all the things which are 5. And kids in primary school, they learn about groups of 5 things, and they learn to take out from the concrete the abstract idea of number 5. And the same is true in all sorts of objects, like a chair. There's different kinds of chairs, but in our minds there's a concept of a chair, an abstract concept. And then we can move away to abstract concepts like beauty and justice and love. Where do these ideas come from? They don't come from matter, because they're not part of matter. They're abstract. So we can think of abstract ideas, if you like, as kind of God's thoughts. He's in somehow causal relationship with them. He's also in relationship with us, and therefore there's no problem why we can't know something about them if we're made in the image of God. Now there are several arguments for God's existence called cosmological arguments, and Thomas Aquinas had 5 of them. I think somebody like Alma Platinus said there's something like 23. I don't know how many there are, but there are lots of arguments for the existence of God. And I'm not going to go through any of the 5. I'm going to mention one which is probably the one which is most obvious, I think, and clearest to everybody. It's about the fact that God is our first cause. It's like when I do something, then there was something before that would cause me to do it. Okay, so if I pick this up, it's because I decide that I need to pick it up, because I need to perhaps turn the page over. And then before that, there was something that caused that. And as you go back, something causes something, you eventually get back to a first cause. And the first cause we can say is God, because God is a causeless being. He existed already. I'll get into God's existence from that point of view a bit later on. But so what we're saying is that there has to be a first cause which we can call God, and it was God that gave rise to the universe. The evidence for this scientifically is a so-called Big Bang theory, and which is derived from Einstein's general theory of relativity. And what this says is that originally there was something very tiny that was immensely dense, immensely heavy, at an extremely high temperature, and it flew apart. And as it flew apart, it cooled down and it formed matter, and eventually the whole of the universe came into being. So what current cosmology says is that the universe had a finite beginning. There was a first cause. In other words, that God brought the world into being. Now the interesting thing about it is that it wasn't the fact that there was time, and then God dropped the universe. Oh, I think I'll have a universe today, and I'll drop it in here. When the universe was created, time and space were created. That's what science tells us. There was nothing before the creation of their world. God is eternal, if you like, in a different set of dimensions, or how you like to describe it, but his existence was eternal, and that's, in that particular time, he actually led the creation of the world to happen. So that's the Big Bang Theory. And when people say, well, look, who created God? That's a nonsense question. Because when you say who created God, you're talking about a time before God. There was no time before God. God is timeless. He's in eternity. He inhabits eternity. And there's lots of scriptures which sort of talk about that. And so that's a non-argument to say who created God. Now, the evidence for a beginning is in various things. The fact that the way matter is distributed throughout the universe, it's fairly uniform everywhere in certain directions. The origin of light elements such as helium. In order for helium to be created, you had to have extremely high temperatures, like 10 to the 42 degrees Kelvin or something like that. Something huge. And then we've got remnants of the original explosion in the sky, and it's picked up by microwave detectors as a uniform glow. And again, it's fairly uniform. Then we've got the second law of thermodynamics, which says that the world is winding down. There are various versions of it. The actual mathematical version of it is that there is an increase in entropy, or an increase in randomness in the universe. So what happens is that things tend to become more random. For example, if you go into a supermarket and you've got a nice stack of tins of peas or something like that, and somebody accidentally knocks it, and it all falls over, you've lost some of the... It's become more random, right? It's fallen down. It's lost its structure. It's fallen down. And if you go away and leave it for 10 years and come back, it'll be a stinking, broken down mess. Because the way I interpret the law, everything falls to bits sooner or later. That's my understanding of the second law. And so things are winding down. If they're winding down, they must have had a beginning. And I can go on with that, but I've got to push on with time. Then there's the simplicity and elegance of mathematics. I like to quote from atheists. They're my favourite source of quotes. A guy called Wigner sums up the equations that underlying the physics of the universe. The normal usefulness of mathematics is something bordering on the mysterious. There's no rational explanation for it. The miracle of the appropriateness of the language of mathematics for the formulation of the laws of physics is a wonderful gift which we neither understand nor deserve. And even Einstein expressed amazement at the comprehensibility of the world. Why is it that we can comprehend the world? There's a designer. There's a designer. Then there's the evidence of fine-tuning. If I drop an object from the top of a building, I can write a mathematical equation for it. This equation needs two things. One, that needs how fast I throw it down. It's called a boundary condition. And the second is we need to know the constant gravity. Two things, boundary conditions and underlying constants. Now the amazing thing about our universe is that when God created the world, everything had to be absolutely right. Not just the laws, but the boundary conditions. And there are scientists that say that unless things are absolutely right, we wouldn't exist. And all the various forces, and I'm going to have to cut this short because I see the time is racing on, because I want to leave time for discussion, but there are four forces in the world that are considered. There's gravitation, electromagnetism, and the strong and weak forces, nuclear forces. Those are four kinds of forces, and there are all kinds of constants. Now these constants have to be absolutely right. If you vary from them by a tiny fraction, we wouldn't be here. So there's a fine-tuning which scientists try and get round if they're not Christian or faith-oriented. They've got to say somehow or other all this amazing combination of both the boundary conditions and the fundamental constants all works out perfectly. Stephen Hawking, who's an atheist, says the laws of science as we know them at present contain many fundamental numbers, like the size of the electric charge of the electron and the ratio of the masses of the proton and the electron. The remarkable fact is that the values of these numbers seem to have been very finely adjusted to make possible the development of life. Then he goes on to say, if the density of the universe 1 second after the Big Bang had been greater by 1 part in 1,000 billion, the universe would have recollapsed after 10 years. On the other hand, if the density of the universe at that time had been less than by the same amount, the universe would have been essentially empty. So it was about 10 years old. And so they themselves say, and they give lots of examples and lots of quotes, not necessarily by theists, that things are fine-tuned to this very, very fine way. Did you know there are about 200 subatomic particles? When I was at school, I thought electron, proton, neutron. That's only 3 I got to remember. There are about 200 now, and they keep finding them. For example, recently they found the Higgs boson, which is basically produces a field which adds mass to particles. And did you know an electron consists of 3 quarks? It's an amazing world. Why is it such as it is? And why can we try and manage to understand it? The next one is evidence of design. We're already going to see all this. If we look at our position in the galaxy, where we're not in the centre where there's a big black hole, no one wants to be there, we're out sort of far enough. The size of the Earth is such that the conditions are okay. Our atmosphere is the right kind, and we've got a nearly circular orbit. The size of our moon keeps our oceans circulating and stops them from getting stagnant. There's our magnetic field. The amazing properties of water. Water freezes from the top down so that fish life can survive. In fact, water is a most unusual substance. Then we've got carbon. Carbon's an amazing metal, element, because of the way it bonds, and it's fundamental to life. And in fact, the appearance of design is very strong in living things. The atheist Dawkins said, "The illusion of purpose is so powerful that biologists themselves use the assumption of good design as the working tool. Biology is a study of complicated things that give the appearance of having been designed for a purpose." Another guy called Davies, "The impression of design is overwhelming." So if the world appears designed, then it must have had a designer. I want to mention briefly genetic code, because that's a very important one. DNA, we know, is responsible from our developing from a full stop, or maybe some people might be a question mark, but full stop, into a fully fledged human being. And our DNA sort of guides our development. And the molecule takes the form of a double helix, like a long ladder, but twisted into a spiral. And the rungs contain 4 bases. Now these bases are like letters of an alphabet. So you can have letters, you can have a sentence, you can even have a paragraph. And so these letters are responsible for coding things like proteins and various other things. Now the interesting thing about it is that there are a huge number of them. There's something like 220 million base pairs in chromosome number 1 in humans. But what's very important is that the message in the DNA molecules is not contained in the molecules. For example, if I said to you, what does PAIN stand for? You'd say, "Oh, pain, listen to this long talk." Pain is actually, in French, it's bread. And the same with gift. Gift in German, which I forgot what it is now. Sorry?
Poison.
Poison, that's right. It's poison, but certainly not known in French. And so what we find is that the actual language is not part of the letters. There's something over and above the letters. It's the grammar that actually tells us what's going on and tells the cell what to do. So therefore, where does it come from? And it's got to be in the right order, because if you look at "you do love me" and "do you love me," they have 2 different messages. And all we've done is just swap 2 words around. So it's very important that the message is okay. So again, design. Then finally we have the moral argument. How are we going? I'm actually a trained counsellor. I've been counselling for 11 years. I still write mathematics, but my love now is for counselling and actually psychology as well. And I've always been intrigued by the evidence that emotions have universal facial expressions. Like, for example, you can recognise an angry face anywhere. You know, it seems to be universal. And this universality extends into the moral realm. For example, we have the so-called golden rule of treating others as you'd like to be treated yourself. This seems to be universal. Okay, there are a few others that follow their own way, but by and large, as a general rule, this golden rule applies right across cultural societies. For example, the protection of marriage and the family. They suggest that there's a universal sense of right and wrong. Actions like rape, torture and child abuse are just not acceptable. Murdering one's own people, lying, cheating and stealing are generally regarded as wrong. Morality seems to be both natural and universal. Now, of course, you can't count for everybody. But by and large, that is true. And those that maintain that morality is relative, they'll get quite upset if their favourite values are ignored or insulted. You know, for example, a drunk driver crashes into their new car, they will have some sort of moral indignation, even though really morality doesn't exist. So there appears to be a universal moral law, and deep down we believe that human rights exist. You know, if we actually think about it ourselves, we have a feeling that you know, everyone should have a right, I should have a right. Also, guilt is another indicator of ultimate right and wrong. Why do we feel guilty? It's a painful feeling that occurs when we think we've violated a moral rule, an ought. We have a conscience that judges us from within. Some find conscience a spoilsport, but it's there for a reason. It's interesting to note that the concept of fairness seems to rise naturally with children, without them having to be taught. So clearly, men and women are moral beings concerned about making the right and wrong decisions. And the question is not just about the existence of morality, but the existence of absolute morality and absolute standard. And to skip through things, one of the things which is hard to explain is altruism. Altruism means you do something not for yourself, but for somebody else. For example, you may be in a situation where you've got to risk your life to save somebody else. Why should you do it? Why should you do it? On the one hand, you think, well, you know, there's sort of a herd instinct. They say, well, I should save the person. On the other hand, there's self-survival. Above that, there's something which comes in and decides. It's not either of those two, it's something else. And so if you read C.S. Lewis, he's got a very good section on this, in his book, Mere Christianity. He goes on and argues that if there's a universal moral law, there's a universal moral lawgiver that gives moral commands. So deep down we support the idea of right conduct, and we feel better when we comply. And then Lewis goes on to argue this lawgiver must be absolutely good, so that our moral effort is not futile in the long run, and the source of all good must be absolutely good. Therefore there must be an absolutely good moral lawgiver we can call God, so we have an absolute moral law. The famous philosopher Immanuel Kant summed things up when he said, two things, and he wasn't really a Christian, and he was a philosopher. Two things fill the mind with ever new and increasing admiration and awe, the more often and steadily we reflect upon them. The starry heavens above me and the moral law within me. Right, that's enough for session one. And I'm not too far out with time. What I'd like to do now is I'll put my glasses on so I can see actually what you really look like. But we can open up now for discussion, and I didn't mention one topic which you might be interested in addition to genetics, is now a subject called epigenetics, which is new. You can ask me that if you like, but it changed their whole way of thinking. And to me it gives some idea of why the verse in the Bible says that the sins of the fathers have been visited on the children to the third and fourth generation. Anyway, I'll leave that up there. But let's raise it open for questions. Or any additional comment. I mean, I appreciate anybody who's got a great idea or something which they found helpful. You know, I found this idea helpful in dealing with these questions. Please tell everybody else so that we can. Yes.
For the fine-tuning argument, I understand that works if there is like a scale in which there are infinite numerical values, and that you've attributed one value to the weakened strong forces, nuclear forces and gravitational force. But is it possible that those values are quite arbitrary because they're human given values? Like the whatever the value is, that is absolutely infinite, like on a sliding scale, is that a human-made concept, the sliding scale, and the value that we are?
And this causes a problem for the atheist. You cannot change things because of what happens is that it's all tied in together. You know, even just the rate of expansion or the amount of material. The answer is no to the question from science, not from me. And you'll find that atheists, I just read a couple of atheists to you. One of them was he's amazed that mathematics works. And then Stephen Hawking basically said, unless this was true to a certain degree, then we wouldn't be here. So it's not arbitrary. The real problem is, if it happened by chance, how do we get such an extreme event, such as our universe? It's a probability problem. And they'll try everything to get around it, like multi-universes and that sort of thing. I won't go down that path, that's another area for discussion. But some try and use that and say, well, look, there's more than one universe, and therefore we happen to get one, so we're lucky. Or we're observers of it, so therefore the fact that we actually observe it means that it's a universe fit for us anyway. There's all sorts of arguments go on, but we come back to this point that everything has happened to a fine degree, and the question is why. Does that help? all the data.
Is there a difference between having proof that God exists and evidence that he exists? And if there is, could you explain that difference?
Well, some Christian philosophers would say that there is proof from logic. One guy in particular, a guy named Edward Feser, who was a non-Christian, an atheist, and through studying Thomas Aquinas, and he's an expert on that, and studying some of the early philosophers, became a Christian. So there were some that say that, they call it fideism, faith. You'd say that no, faith is not just a thing, there's logic. But for me, I think in the end, there's no such thing as proof of God, because God, in a way, is a personal. We need a personal understanding of the existence of God, not a scientific or a logical one. And some of them will argue, and I can't remember all the arguments, I don't want to go into them and bore you with them, but a personal explanation is just as important as a scientific explanation. And so there's some philosophers who say, well, look, like Keith Ward, who's a well-known one, who would say that personal explanation does not reduce to a scientific or a logical one. So it depends what you mean by evidence. I know what you're saying. Can we prove it? The answer is, well, it depends on the person as to whether they think it's valid enough or not. As a mathematician, I'm very much convinced by the mathematics of it, and the fact that knowing a bit about the mathematics and knowing a bit about quantum theory and what it tells us today, which is really, really weird, I can appreciate that somehow or other we're moving into an area which we're only just grasping around the edges, understanding. There had to be something behind that which is not just material, but something intangible. I hope that helps, Andrew.
I think you said that fundamental constants all work together harmoniously. That's right. Is one of the constants the freezing point of water?
No, I was thinking of the basically like a gravitation constant, the ratios of the size of the particles, electrons, protons, the size of the magnetic field. What I mean by well, yes, the freezing point of water, of course, is an interesting one, but it's derivable from the others. What I'm saying is that as we go down through, there are some laws which are based on these laws, which are based on these laws. When you get down to the bottom, you've got fundamental constants which drive Maxwell's equations and the four equations of Einstein, field equations. Underneath there is these constants in basic mathematics, which it's hard to explain why it's there. and why we can even understand it. You know, it's really strange. Derek, yeah.
George, a cynical response to your paper would be that yes, you provided an excellent argument for intelligent design. But what does that mean, God?
Well, it doesn't tell you about the type of God. Right? The question is the existence of God, not the existence of the Christian God. Okay? So that's talk for another day. But I understand. There are lots of questions left unanswered in this talk because we're only dealing with one topic. And we don't know whether it's a God of love or what sort of God we have. Or we know, for example, in Romans 1:26, is it? That God has revealed himself in the things that he has made.
Yes.
Still doesn't tell us what sort of God,
No.
but at least it does tell us that there is a God, and then we can see God. And similarly with Paul, when he was in Athens, Acts 16, where he's talking with the philosophers, he talks about a God who is known, because they had a statue to an unknown God, and he talked about this God that's closer to us than we think, and in him we live and have our being. He wasn't talking about the Christian God, he was just talking about God. And so the focus of this talk is on that, and I agree that it does not go far enough. Is that
very
okay?
difficult, but yeah, it's all good stuff. It's great.
Thank you. Do you want to have a short break, because there's another session to come?